I'm Russ. My pronouns are he and him. So remember this portion of the story of God as is written in the book that we love, Acts chapter 8, verse 26 through 40, reading from the Inclusive Bible Translation. An angel of God spoke to Philip and said, "Be ready to set out at noon along the road that goes to Gaza, the desert road." So Philip began his journey. It happened that an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official in charge of the entire treasury of Candace, the ruler of Ethiopia, had come to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage and was returning home. He was sitting in his carriage and reading from the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit said to Philip, "Go up and meet that carriage." When Philip ran up, he heard the eunuch was reading Isaiah, the prophet, and asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" "How can I," the eunuch replied, "unless someone explains it to me?" With that, he invited Philip to get into the carriage with him. This is the passage of the scripture being read. "You are like a sheep being led to slaughter. You are like a lamb that is mute in front of its shearers. Like them, you never open your mouth. You have been humiliated and have no one to defend you. Who will ever talk about your descendants, since your life on earth has been cut short?" The eunuch told Philip, "Tell me, if you will, about whom is the prophet speaking, himself or someone else?" So Philip proceeded to explain the good news about Jesus to him. Further along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, there is some water right here. Is there anything to keep me from being baptized?" He ordered the carriage to stop. Then Philip and the eunuch both went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came out of the water, the Spirit of God snatched Philip away. The eunuch didn't see him anymore and went on his way, rejoicing. Philip found himself at Ashdod next and went about proclaiming the good news in all the towns until he came to Caesarea. This ends this reading from this portion of the book of the Acts.
My name is Lois Lehman. I'm a retired Presbyterian pastor. My pronouns are she and her, but I'd honestly rather you use my name in reference to me. Remember this portion of the story of God as it is written in the book we love, Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 29, from the Inclusive Bible Translation. About noon the next day, shortly before they were to arrive at Joppa, Peter went up to the roof terrace to pray. He was hungry and asked for something to eat. While the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. Peter saw heaven standing open and something like a large sheet being lowered to the earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of animals, birds, and reptiles. A voice said, "Stand up, Peter, make your sacrifice and eat." But Peter said, "I can't, my God. I have never eaten anything profane or unclean." The voice spoke a second time and said, "Don't call anything profane that God has made clean." This happened 3 times. Then the sheet disappeared into the heavens. Peter was still pondering this when Cornelius' deputation arrived. They had asked directions to Simon's house and were now standing at the door. They called out to ask if Simon, known as Peter, was there. While Peter reflected on the vision, the Spirit said, "A deputation is here to see you. Hurry down and don't hesitate to go with them. I sent them here." Peter went down and said to the deputation, "I'm the one who are you looking for? What do you want?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing person, respected by the Jewish people, was directed by a holy angel to send for you. We are bringing you to the household of Cornelius to hear what you have to say." Peter invited them in and gave them hospitality. Peter left the next day, accompanied by some of the co-workers from Joppa. They reached Cornelius the day after. Cornelius was waiting for them, along with his household and many close friends. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him, dropped to his knees, and bowed down. As he helped Cornelius to his feet, Peter said, "Get up, I'm a human being just like you." While talking with Cornelius, Peter went in and found many people gathered there. He said to them, "You know it's unlawful for a Jew to associate with Gentiles or visit them. But God made it clear to me not to call anyone unclean or impure. That's why I made no objection when I was summoned here."
For the purposes of this sermon, it's important that I self-identify as a law keeper.
Wait a minute.
Oh, that's true, but
Not his turn.
but it's not according to the script.
The Gospel of Luke, which we've been following in this year's lectionary, and the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, were written by the same author. I learned that in seminary, but seminary was a long time ago. And so I looked up on the internet what evidence there is that these two books were written by the same person. First, there are the opening words of the two books. Luke begins, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." Acts begins, "In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote all that Jesus did." Sounds like the same author. Second, the style of writing, the vocabulary are the same. Now, I know that facts and evidence are not in vogue these days, but I'm woke, and I guess part of being woke is being interested in facts and evidence. In his gospel, Luke emphasizes Jesus' good news to the poor and oppressed, and the actions of Jesus in behalf of the vulnerable, those without power and wealth, those who are considered unclean. We see this emphasis continuing in the book of Acts, and we see the transition of the Christian community from being Jewish followers of Jesus and those of other faiths and ethnicities who had experienced Jesus for themselves, to being the good news for the whole world, shared by people who had not experienced Jesus for themselves, but rather than by the apostles. In this morning's reading from Acts 8, which Russ read, we heard of Philip's baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch, a person who was not only not from Jerusalem, but was from Ethiopia, 1,000 miles away. A person who was by Jewish law forbidden from entering the holy portion of the temple where the men assembled. He was considered unclean. In Acts 10, we get the story of the meeting of Cornelius, a Gentile, and Peter, a devout Jew, who was taught to never be in the company of a Gentile. For Gentiles were among those people who were considered to be unclean. If a Jew found himself in the company of someone considered unclean, he had to go through elaborate rituals before he could be considered clean again. Peter had a vision of something like a sheet full of animals with God's voice telling him, "God, get up, Peter, go, kill and eat." And when Peter resisted, he was a rule follower. God commanded, "Do not call anything profane, which I have made clean." Earlier in the book of Acts, there is an account of the selection of 7 men to wait on tables because the disciples were too busy preaching and teaching to take care of the mundane tasks like getting food for them. Philip was one of those chosen, along with Stephen and others whose names are totally lost to us unless you happen to read the book of Acts. From Acts 8, we learn that this Philip, not the disciple that I thought the story was about in the first place, that this disciple was stopped by a man in a chariot. The man, we are told, was a eunuch, the treasurer to the Queen Candace of Ethiopia. He might have been Jewish because he had come to Jerusalem to worship, and he could read the writing of the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. There were Jews living in Ethiopia centuries before the Jews had been exiled to Ethiopia. When Russ was seeing an ear, nose, and throat doctor because of recurrent nosebleeds, that doctor, who was Jewish, told us that his wife was an Ethiopian Jew. And the Ethiopian Jews believed that the Ark of the Covenant was carried to Ethiopia in that earlier exile, and that it's still there. So at the time of the early church, there were native Ethiopians who were Jewish. Philip asked the eunuch if he understood, and the eunuch said, well, how can I understand if no one will even talk about it with me? And here's where we run into Luke's emphasis on the ministry to the poor and oppressed. Eunuchs were considered unclean and therefore not allowed to worship in the portion of the temple where men gathered, and not allowed to sit into the assembly where the scriptures were discussed. Philip, an ordinary man, a man who was not chosen to be one of the apostles, chosen only to do those menial tasks that the important men were too busy to do, told the Ethiopian all about Jesus, all about the good news of the gospel. He was an evangelist. The eunuch's response was to ask what would prevent him from being baptized, and as they came to the water, they stopped the chariot. Philip baptized the eunuch. The eunuch, we presume, returned home. And there may be many people in Egypt these days, many Coptic Christians, who can trace their religious heritage to this Ethiopian eunuch.
Well, I'm still the lawgiver, so I'm back. The good news messenger will come back in a few minutes. I, like Simon Peter, was taught to obey the law. My father was a bower. Now, a bower is a German farmer, and those guys did not invent law keeping, but they perfected it to an art form. This is a mindset, like an addiction. I mean, one doesn't get over it, one just tries to manage it. It never really goes away. Once a bower, always a bower. I was taught that there are a million reasons to break the law, but only one reason to keep it. It's the law. I was taught to know that I am part of something bigger, a bigger cog in a bigger machine that is about something beyond myself, and that other people are counting on me to follow the rules, to follow the law, and making their decisions based on that assumption. Have you ever stopped at a stop sign and had the driver with the right-of-way stop? It creates total chaos in the traffic world and sends the whole chaos spinning out of control. How does one get over it when someone doesn't follow the rules? Law-keeping is not a bad thing, but it can get out of hand. If one isn't careful, one can begin to see the world in black and white. Us, the law keepers, and them, those who are less observant of the laws. Keepers of the law and breakers of the law. The just and the unjust, the clean and the unclean. I've had the rather dubious honor of having survived Marine Corps boot camp twice. Once as a 17-year-old recruit on his way to Vietnam, and again some 15 years later as a chaplain. I found that in that 15 years, many things had changed. The food in the officers' club was superior to that in the recruit mess hall, and the service was a lot better. But there was something that had changed that was even more significant. When I went through boot camp, I was told to do what I was told when I was told to do it. End of story. Now, if you had to stop and if told to jump and you had to ask how high, you were already too late. This was right in my wheelhouse as the son of a bower. Give me a clear order, and I'm on a straight line. That's been suggested that that's why I can march, but I can't dance. I can even march without waving to the crowd and making it look like a birthday celebration. When I returned to where it all begins, the land of the yellow footprints, a new element had been added to the training. Recruits were being taught to make decisions in high-pressure scenarios. The phrase, just following orders, had been replaced with obeying my last lawful order. Recruits were being taught to think, something that was not encouraged at all in my time, and perhaps for good reasons. In times of war, soldiers are subject to see things that no one should ever see, and they are called upon to do things that no one should ever have to do. During the Vietnam War, the horrors of war were brought into America's living rooms. There have always been atrocities and misdeeds carried out in the name of following orders. But now, we had seen it, and we could no longer, and we could not unsee it. After the massacre at My Lai, 26 soldiers were charged with criminal offenses. They did what they did in the name of just following orders. While only one was ever convicted of a crime, the rules had changed forever. Now we knew that there are some things that you just cannot do in the name of following orders. Now, I did not get my penchant for following the rules simply from my father. There was also my mother. My mother was from a strict holiness religious tradition that was very much focused on keeping the law. I was taught there that you do not have to understand God's law, you simply have to obey it. God has a plan, and you are either part of the unfolding of God's plan or you are standing in God's way and disrupting the unfolding of God's plan. There was no grace in this, and the motivation for righteous behavior was the fear of being found unclean by God and excluded from God's kingdom. My mother's little sister was in a car accident as a teenager, and her hand was permanently crippled. I was never told why it was that her hand could not be repaired, but her father, my grandfather, an itinerant holiness minister, told everyone he met, including me, many, many years later, that it was God's judgment on her for being in a car with a boy. As it is written on the doorway to paradise, those who falter and those who fall must pay the price. My aunt never left home. She never got a driver's license or went away to school. She never had a real job. I'd be surprised if she spent more than a dozen nights in her whole life under some other roof, in some other bed. She lived in her parents' house throughout their lives, tending them in their old age, and then after their death, she remained there until she died. Terrible things have been done to God's children in the name of God's law. We may find it comforting to follow the rules, to color within the lines, to not make waves, to be in line, as the Bowers would say it. But in the name of following the law and in fear of being found unholy or unclean. But we have a responsibility beyond the law. We are responsible for the effects of our actions and our inactions, the effects that they have on other people, the harm that they may do. Even when we are keeping the law, there are things that we simply cannot do. and things that we simply cannot leave undone. Simon's rooftop experience changed his life forever. He was called to go to Cornelius, to accept the hospitality of one who was considered unclean, and in doing so become unclean, to eat foods that were forbidden by the law, to sacrifice years of righteous, blameless living for the sake of a centurion. I frequently hear the phrase these days that no one is above the law. But in fact, everyone is above the law. Everyone is one of those million reasons to break the law. When it comes to choosing between keeping the law and loving your neighbor, everyone is above the law. I have kept every jot and tittle of the law continually from my youth, will not be a defense if we have not heard the cry of the needy and the oppressed, because we have now seen the harm that can do, and we cannot unsee it. And the law, keeping the law, will never bring us the peace of living in harmony with all of our brothers and sisters, nor the joy of being part of God's true kingdom.
The law has been used to exclude some people. We may not use the term unclean these days, but throughout the history of the church, there have been some folks who have judged others as being unfit, saying things like, those people don't belong in church, or they're not even Christians. The good news of the gospel is that we're all beloved children of God. We all belong. If Philip had struck strictly to the law, he wouldn't have baptized an Ethiopian eunuch. Jesus ate with the unclean, spoke to women in public, and healed on the Sabbath. In his life and in his teachings, Jesus' message was that God's love is for all people. When we follow his example, we find ourselves in the company of a great diversity of people, a joyful, wonderful, great diversity of people, all striving to follow the pathway that leads to shalom, harmony, wholeness, peace, and joy. It's not always easy. In fact, I suspect that it's always hard to move away from that which we've been taught from our childhood, to leave behind those attitudes and behaviors which seem normal in our past. And it's sometimes hard to just determine what is right and what is wrong, what loving behavior really looks like. But the advice that we get from Luke's gospel is that when in doubt, the behavior which offers the most support for the most vulnerable among us is the behavior we should follow. This is the ministry to which we've all been called. Amen.